Welcome to this trip through one of the scariest cases in U.S. history. Let me know where you're watching from, because the story we're about to read has been going on for over 100 years without any answers. A cold November night in 1901 marked the start of a mystery that still lives on in the dusty records of Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was the industrial center of the United States back then. Pittsburgh got bigger like a furnace on fire. Its chimneys sent out dark smoke that made the sky gray all day and night. But there were places that were completely silent, away from the noisy factories and streets full of workers. These were places that had not yet been modernized with electric light and telegraphs, and it all began in one of these forgotten places. The hilly area north of Pittsburgh was known for its thick forests and paths that wound their way through deep valleys. There were farmers, lumberjacks, and other simple people living there who rarely. They went to the big city. Because they had to, they relied on each other. That year, winter came early, so the towns stayed away until spring, when the roads could be opened again. This is where Martha Crowley went missing. She was 28 years old and lived alone on a small piece of land that her family had given her after her husband died in a sawmill accident 3 years before. People in the area knew Martha for how good she was at using herbs for medicine. People from all over came to see what she was doing to get ready for. Having fevers, pains, and stomach problems. People trusted her, and she had never done anything to make them suspicious. Martha was last seen walking along the road that led to the Henshaw property in the afternoon of November 16, 1901. The Henshaw family lived about 3 kilometers away from Martha's home. She was carrying a basket that was covered in a white cloth. She was also wearing her well-known brown woolen shawl. 3 people who saw Martha that afternoon confirmed what they had seen. She did it as the sun was setting. She walked by the blacksmith's house, waved at his wife, and kept going. Martha never got to the Honoris and never came back home. Landlady Henshaw thought it was odd that Martha hadn't shown up, but she wasn't worried right away. It's possible that she changed her mind. She might have been sick and gone home. When she went to Martha's house the next day to check, she found it locked, the chickens hungry in the coop, and no sign that anyone had returned the night before. The fear began to spread at that point. The men in the area quickly got themselves together. In groups, they searched every part of that road, as well as the nearby woods, streams, and ravines. They looked for days. No one ever found Martha's basket. The brown shawl was never found. No fabric, no clear footprint, and no sign of a fight or an escape. In the cold November air, it seemed like Martha Crowley had just disappeared. He is the sheriff of Allegheny County, and There was a man named Thomas Bridger who led the investigation himself. People knew Bridger for both his persistence and his doubt. He didn't believe in disappearances for no reason. He always thought there was someone behind it. There was always a reason, and he was set on finding both. A drifter who had been seen in the area days before the disappearance was first thought to be responsible. A middle-aged man with a gray beard and worn-out clothes who slept in barns when he was allowed to by farms and begged for food there. However, Bridger finally found him in a small town 30 kilometers away. The man had a good reason for not being guilty. He was working on a farm the day Martha went missing, and 5 different people saw him. He then turned his attention to the people next door. He talked to each person who knew Martha one by one. As he asked more questions, he became aware that someone did not want to say something. This made things more strange. There was an awkward silence over all of the conversations. Turned away looks, not clear answers. Everyone seemed to know something but had agreed in silence not to say it. In December, winter came in full force and covered everything with thick snow. The searches had to be put on hold. Bridger didn't give up, but he had to wait this time. Do not move until the snow melts. Wait until spring to find out. But there was something much worse in the spring of 1902. When March 1902 came around and the snow stopped falling in the Pennsylvania hills, Sheriff Bridger went back to looking with more energy. He spent the winter going over every detail, witness statement, and piece of information he had gathered, and he still couldn't put his mind off of something. It was so quiet that you could tell everyone knew more than you were saying. At that point, a second person vanished. Elelena Vance was 32 years old and built clothes. She lived in a rented house on the edge of a small village called Millvale, not far from where Martha was last seen. "Hi, Elelena." She wasn't married, she lived alone, and she made money by sewing for wealthy families in the area. It was hard to get close to her because she rarely spoke or smiled. That morning, March 23rd, Elelena left home and told her landlady that she was going to bring dresses to 2 farms nearby. She carried a big cloth bag with her where she kept her orders, which were neatly folded. She had on a dark coat and hat. 3 people saw her waving to people she knew as she walked along the main road. Eleanor Vance never came back home. This time, the alarm went off right away. Martha's disappearance still made people feel bad. Now, another woman had been seen, but not seen since. Panic spread through the area. A lot of people started locking their doors during the day. Women stopped walking by themselves. There were more and more rumors going around. Bridger set up new searches that were even bigger than the old ones. This time, he brought men from Pittsburgh who were experienced trackers and even some sniffer dogs that had know how to find people who are missing. They looked for clues along the same paths and in the same woods, making their search area bigger. After 2 days, they found Elelena's purse by a stream that ran through the forest. There was nothing in the purse. The dresses she was carrying were gone, but there were no signs of violence or a fight, and it didn't look like she had been dragged or forced to go anywhere. It looked like Elelena had just left her bag there and gone into the woods on her own, which didn't make any sense. Makes no sense at all. The cases were first written about in Pittsburgh newspapers. Headlines made a lot of noise about a predator in the hills, hidden dangers on country roads, and women who disappeared like smoke. Fear spread to other parts of the world. Every day, mail came to the sheriff's office. Some are offering help, others are spreading crazy ideas, and a lot of them are just scared. It was during this time of growing paranoia that Bridger got a surprise visitor, a very old man who only called himself Mr. On a rainy April afternoon, Whitmore went to the sheriff's office. He said he knew something about the disappearances but didn't want to talk about it in public. He was taken by Bridger to a room that was closed off. What he heard there changed the whole investigation. Whitmore said that there was an empty house in the hills that people in the area had been avoiding for years. The house belonged to a family that left the area without giving a reason many years ago, taking everything with them. The property had become a mess since then, but there were old stories about that spot. People didn't want to say the rumors out loud. Whitmore said that some people had recently seen people moving around on that property. They had seen smoke rising from the chimney at night, dim lights shining through broken windows, and strange sounds resonating through the trees nearby. He had no idea who was there, but he thought Bridger should find out. Then, Fitmore said something that made the sheriff very angry before he left. He said it wasn't the first time a woman had gone missing in that area. After searching all night in the county's old records, Bridger finally found what he was looking for. There were 3 women who went missing in similar ways between 1887 and 1889. They all lived alone. All of them were last seen walking on country roads. They were not found at all. At the time, the sheriff was in charge of investigations that didn't lead anywhere. The cases were forgotten and buried under piles of dusty papers. Records. Now Bridger had a real lead, though. He had a spot to check out. The next morning, he got together 6 men he trusted and went to the abandoned property. The path was hard to follow because it was full of thick plants that grew over the old trail. When they got there, they saw a broken-down wooden house with moss-covered walls and a roof that had partially collapsed. The windows were broken, and the front door only had one hinge. However, there were fresh footprints in the mud around the house. Someone had been. That's it. Bridger and his men went in slowly. It was dark and cold inside, and the air smelled like mildew and wet dirt. Fresh ashes in the fireplace, leftover food on a makeshift table, and a blanket spread out on the floor of one of the rooms were all clear signs that someone had been there recently. Then, in the basement, they found something that made everyone instantly jump. A short, rotten wooden staircase that creaked with each step led down to the cellar. Bridger was the first to slip and fall, lantern whose light danced on the damp stone walls. He wasn't sure what the smell was, but the air down there was thick and heavy. He didn't want to name it because it was somewhere between churned-up earth and something scarier. The men had to hunch their backs because the room was small and the ceiling was low. In one corner, boxes were stacked and old spider webs were all over them. Hooks on the walls held old tools. Something made Bridger stop in the middle of the basement. His tracks. It was a hole dug in the hard-packed earth that is about 1 meter wide and whose depth can't be determined until more research is done. The ground around it was dark and damp from having just been moved. There was also a piece of brown fabric partially buried next to the hole. Bridger knew what it was right away. The shawl Martha Crowley was wearing the day she went missing was also made of the same kind of fabric. He had his men carefully dig with shovels they found in the basement, with every floor of the earth. When it was taken away, the tension rose. No one spoke. The men's heavy breathing and the tools cutting through the ground were the only sounds. They dug for hours, going deeper and deeper until they found something solid. They didn't expect to find that. At the bottom of the hole, there was a kind of tunnel, a narrow, horizontal passageway that had been dug with simple tools and held up by old planks. A man couldn't go through the tunnel standing up because it was too shallow. He had to crawl, and it led somewhere deep in the earth, going away completely in the dark. Bridger looked at his men and saw that they were all scared. There was no way out for him. They all didn't want to go in. There was a chance to find Martha and Eleanor and learn what had really happened at the end of that tunnel. He crawled in by himself with his flashlight in front of him. Bridger moved forward through the small tunnel. On both sides, the earth walls pressed against his body. He felt roots on his back as they hung from the low ceiling. As he moved forward, the air got thinner and thinner. In his ears, he could hear his own heart beating. Even though it was cold, he could feel sweat running down his face. The tunnel opened up into a bigger room after what seemed like hours. When Bridger raised his flashlight, he saw something that made him freeze. The chamber, which was about 3 meters in diameter, was a hole dug for a specific reason. They were carefully placed on the walls. Stones, making it look like it was built with care and time. In the middle, there was a wooden structure that looked like a table or a makeshift altar. Personal items were set up on this structure in a way that looked like it was meant to be ceremonial. An empty wicker basket, a gray coat with wooden buttons, pieces of fabric that looked like they had been worn, women's shoes, several pairs lined up next to each other, and many other things that clearly belonged to different people. Over the years, but there were no bodies. There were no bones left. There was no sign of what happened to the missing women in the end. Bridger looked at each thing with hands that were shaking. He knew that it was Martha's shawl. He knew the coat that witnesses said Eleanor was wearing. But there were also other things there that probably belonged to the women who went missing in 1887 and 1889, or even older things that were never reported. Along the walls of the room, someone had made marks in the rock. They weren't words. They were weird symbols and patterns that kept happening over and over again. Bridger wrote some of them down in his notebook while shaking and drawing. On it were also the years 1887, 1889, and 1901, along with vertical lines next to each date, as if someone were counting. Bridger was very pale and sweating a lot when he finally came out of the tunnel. His men helped him get up and asked him important questions, but he couldn't put together words right away. He had to sit down. Before telling what he had found, he had to calm down, take a deep breath, and put his thoughts in order. Everything changed when that underground room was found. No longer were there just two separate disappearances. It was much bigger than that. It happened over many years and was carefully planned and carried out by someone who knew that area inside and out. But who? Where was that person now? Bridger gave his men orders to watch over the empty land. If anyone went back there, they would be caught. He went back to his office and started putting the puzzle together while that was going on. He looked at every part of the old investigations, tried to find patterns, and tried to connect the victims in ways that weren't obvious. He then came to a very important realization. The women who went missing all lived alone, which was something they had in common. Every single one of them had been last seen walking toward the same general area of hills. It's not always the same path, but it always ends up in the same place where a piece of abandoned property was found. They felt like someone was pulling them there. But how and why? Bridger spent days questioning again everyone who had seen the people go missing. Now that he knew more, he started to press harder. He was adamant that someone had to know something because so much could not have happened without anyone noticing something odd. And that's how he finally broke the silence. On a cloudy afternoon, a woman named Sarah Brennan went looking for Bridger. In May. When she got to the sheriff's office, she wore a dark veil over her face and asked to talk to someone alone. When he offered her a cup of tea, her hands shook, and when she finally spoke, her voice was almost a whisper. Sarah said that there was a man in the area that she only knew as Dr. Monroe. People called him a doctor, even though he wasn't one, because he said he knew about herbs and treatments that mainstream medicine didn't know about. Monroe had shown up in the region around 1885, seemingly out of nowhere, and had made their home in a small, lonely cabin in the hills. At first, people didn't trust him. He was tall and thin, and his eyes were so bright that they seemed to see right through people. Some of the people who lived there started to trust him, even though he didn't say much or smile much. He sold cures for illnesses that doctors in the city couldn't treat. He charged very little or nothing, and it looked like his work worked. Sarah said that Monroe had helped her sister when she was younger, that they were in constant pain that no treatment could ease. Monroe made a herbal mixture for her, and it took away the pain. Lots of people told similar stories about him, which made him famous, even though he never mixed with the community. Monroe was strange, though. He looked very interested in women who lived alone. He would show up at their homes and offer to help with heavy work, home repairs, and getting firewood ready for winter. He never charged for anything and was always nice, helpful, and the women started to trust him because they were thankful for it. Sarah thought about what to say for a long time before continuing. Then she told them what had really brought her there. Monroe had helped her sister, but she was last seen in 1889. She was one of the women who was never found, one of the old cases that Bridger found in the files. Also, Sarah had always thought Monroe was up to no good, but she never had the guts to say anything. She was scared. Folks were scared of him because there were whispers that, passed around only in the most private conversations. People said Monroe did more than heal. People said he did strange rituals in his cabin and believed in dark forces that lived in the earth's depths. They also said he was looking for something, like forbidden knowledge that could only be gained through practices that no one was brave enough to name. Bridger listened in silence and wrote down everything he heard. He told Sarah he was proud of her bravery and would look into it when she was done. Where was Monroe now? He asked, which was the most important question. Sarah shook her head. No one was sure. He was last seen a few months ago, in October 1901, not long before Martha went missing. Even though his cabin was empty, some people said they had seen him walking along the paths on the hills at night, always far away and looking like a ghost. Bridger set up a bigger operation after getting this new information. He sent more troops from Pittsburgh to help. Armed, using skilled and organized men, he planned searches all over the area, focusing on the hill's most remote areas, and was able to find Monroe's old cabin. It was even farther away from everything else than the abandoned house where they found the tunnel. To get there, you had to follow trails that were hard to see, cross 2 streams, and climb a steep hill that was thick with pine trees. The cabin was very well kept for how small it was. It was made of solid logs and had a wooden shingle roof that had stood the test of time. The test of time. From the inside, the door was locked. Bridger and his men broke down the door and found something else that made them uncomfortable. It was simple and almost empty inside the cabin. In one corner, there was a simple bed, a small table, and a chair. All 4 walls were lined with shelves that were full of glass jars that held dried herbs, roots, and powdered substances of different colors. There were also a lot of books, dozens of them neatly stacked. Bridger looked through the books. Even though most of them were in English, he forgot to recognize. The title talked about old philosophies, mystical practices, and ideas about what consciousness is and how we exist. Monroe had written notes in the margins about what he was reading in very small, clear handwriting. Bridger found notebooks and diaries on a desk in the corner. Monroe had written down her thoughts and experiments in them, and that's where the scary truth started to come out. Monroe thought he had found out something important about people. Writing. About how what he called separation rituals could help people go beyond physical existence and reach a higher state of consciousness. His notes show that he had been testing his ideas for years, always looking for people who would be willing to help him with his research. But Bridger quickly saw that there were no real volunteers. Monroe had a special talent for finding weak, lonely people who were looking for a connection or a reason to live. With kindness and care, he won them over and gained. He earned their trust over months and even years, and when he was sure they were ready, he took them to the abandoned house and into the chamber below. What did that happen? Monroe talked about it in general and philosophical terms. He was talking about freedom, going beyond, and crossing lines that can't be seen. He never did say exactly what he did, though. He never went into specifics about the rituals. It looked like he left gaps in the records on purpose, like he wanted to keep something secret, even in his own mind. Records. It was clear, though, that none of the women who took part in these rituals came back. Monroe wrote about this as if it were normal, expected, or even wanted, as if the women had found exactly what they were looking for. As Bridger read, his stomach hurt. He was hearing the confessions of someone who was clearly troubled, and who had used a flawed philosophy to explain bad behavior. Not yet, though, was the most important puzzle piece. Monroe, where were you now? And where were Martha and Alelina, which was more important? Monroe's last entry in his diary was on March 20th, 1902, which was only 3 days before Alelina Vance went missing. In it, he wrote about having a strong feeling that his work was being watched, and that the forces he had studied so much were about to reveal something very important. He talked about getting ready for a final ritual, which he said was the result of decades of study and experimentation. Bridger asked for his. Men to search the whole cabin. That's how they found something very important. They lifted the floorboards, looked for hidden spaces in the walls, and went through every book looking for hidden pages or maps. A detailed map of the area with clear lines that seemed to show where important things were. There were other marks besides the circle that showed where the abandoned property was. The hills were marked with small X's, and next to each one was a date. Bridger found a total of 12 marks, 12. 12 dates in 12 different places over almost 20 years. Being aware that he was looking at a picture of all the disappearances sent a chill down his spine. There was a 13th mark on the map, though. It was very far away, even further into the hills, in a place that not many people knew about. Monroe had written just one word next to this tag: portal. Bridger decided that they had to look into that place right away. He got his best men together, checked their weapons, and made sure they had enough food to last the night. Hills, if you have to. The next morning, at dawn, they set out, following the directions on the map. It was a hard journey. As they moved forward, the ground got steeper and less level. They went through places where there were so many trees that they blocked out almost all the sunlight, making it always dark, even in the middle of the day. They went across frozen streams, climbed mossy rock formations, and followed animal tracks where there were no more human tracks to be found. It took almost 6 hours to get to the place shown on the map, and when they did find it, they knew why Monroe had picked that spot. It was a beautiful, natural feature crack in the rock that looked like a wound in the ground on the side of a hill. The hole was about 2 meters high and 1 meter wide. It went deep into the mountain and disappeared into the darkness. Ice stalagmites hung from the entrance like sharp teeth, and a cold wind that smelled like minerals and damp air came from inside the cave all the time. Monroe built a wall around the front door, an altar of sorts. There were stones arranged in concentric circles and strange patterns carved into the bigger rocks, the same ones Bridger had seen in the underground chamber. On the floor, there were things that clearly belonged to the missing women, like a silver brooch, a faded hairband, a prayer book with worn chants, and small personal items that had been left there as gifts. Bridger lit torches and led 3 of his men into the cave. It was even more impressive inside than outside. The natural crack turned into an A. The underground gallery is pretty big, and the ceiling gets up to about 10 meters high in some spots. The structure was held up by natural pillars made of rock formations. The sound of water dripping kept resonating, making a haunting and hypnotic melody. They moved slowly, following a path that looked like it had been used before. People had walked on the ground for years, making it smooth in some places. There were more carved symbols and marks on the walls that Monroe had made to record his obsession. The main. There were several smaller tunnels that led off from the gallery. Bridger picked the biggest one that looked like it had the most people in it, and went down. With each step, the water sound got louder and the air got colder. It was clear that they were going down toward a river underground. After walking through the tunnel for about 15 minutes, it opened up into a huge room. It was there, in the dim light of the torches, that Bridger finally found what he was looking for. In the middle of the room, there was something that looked like a camp. Clearly, they just moved. There were blankets spread out on the stone floor, a bag with food scraps hanging from a rock ledge, and a small pile of firewood next to a campfire that had just been put out. Heavy ropes that cut into their wrists held the ashes to a rock formation. They were still warm. 5 women were still alive. Martha Crowley and Alellanena Vance were 2 of them. They were weak and thirsty, and their eyes and lips were cracked and sunken. They were dirty and torn, and their hair was all messed up. They blinked when the flashlight light hit their faces. With trouble, as if the light hurt them after being in the dark for so long. Bridger and his men moved quickly to free them. They used knives to cut the ropes and held the women when their legs gave out, and they could no longer stand. Martha started to cry quietly because she was too weak to speak. Ellelenina didn't say a word, and just stared into space with a look that Bridger would never forget. Monroe wasn't there, but it felt like a part of her had been stuck in that darkness for a long time, even though all the signs pointed to that he had been in that room not long ago. He had left. When they asked Martha and Eleanor where he was, both of them just shook their heads. Eleanor could only whisper a few words because her voice was so weak. He went further. From the back of the room, Bridger could see that there was another passageway. This one was different from the others because it was narrower and steeper, and it was clearly natural and hadn't been changed by people. It made that constant sound of water running, which was now so loud it was almost deafening. He knew he had to keep going. He was sure Monroe was down there in the unknown depths of that mountain. But when he saw how badly Martha and Ellelenina were hurt, he knew that getting them out of there alive had to be his top priority. He let two of the men keep exploring the cave while he and the third man helped the women get back to the surface. The trip back was very painful. Eleanor and Martha were really weak. They were so heavy that they had to be carried. Bridger was afraid at every step. They were not going to make it, but both of them had an inner strength that kept them going, a will to live that was stronger than the physical pain. When they finally came out of the cave and the dusk light hit their faces, Martha fell to the ground and hugged it like she never wanted to let go. Going down the mountain with Martha and Eleanor took them almost the whole night. In the dark, the only light coming from the torches that flickered in the cold wind through the pines made the way back very dangerous. Bridger and his men. Every few minutes, they had to stop so the women could rest, catch their breath, and get back up to speed. Ellelenina had a deep cough that made her shake very hard every time she coughed. Martha's feet had open wounds all over them. They were wrapped in old clothes that got wet with blood quickly, but they kept going. Bridger was very impressed by those two women. Even after everything they had been through and weeks of being trapped in the dark and only getting enough food to stay alive, they fought with all the strength they had and didn't complain. They didn't ask to end it. Putting one foot in front of the other, their only goal was to get out of that scary place. It was after 3 a.m. when they finally got to the main road. A member of Bridger's team went ahead and got a wagon. It was waiting for them there, pulled by two strong horses. Martha and Eleanor were put on thick blankets in the back of the wagon, and they were driven to the house of a doctor. Bridger knew someone in Millvale. He was 60 years old, had white hair and steady hands. Dr. Harrington had been a surgeon in the Civil War and had seen so many horrible things that he wasn't easily scared. But when he looked at Martha and Ellelenina that morning, he was shocked, not only by the many wounds they had, rope marks, severe dehydration, and infected wounds, but also by what he saw in their eyes. There was a void there that he knew from soldiers who had been killed. They were prisoners of war for too long. Harrington took care of the two women until dawn. He cleaned their wounds, put ointments on them, put bandages on their wrists and ankles, gave them fluids, and gave them medicine for their fevers. When the sun finally came up over the hills in Pennsylvania, he sat down with Bridger, and they had a tough talk. He told them that Martha and Ellelenina would get better. It would take some time, but their bodies were still young and strong. What scared him was not being able to do it. You can see how those weeks of being locked up hurt their minds. He had seen this kind of trauma happen before. It doesn't get better with bandages and medicine. He also told Bridger that he would need patience and care when it was time to question them. Bridger agreed, but he knew he had to act quickly. The two men he had left to explore the caves still hadn't come back, and his worry grew with each hour that went by. He wanted to know what Monroe had in mind. We needed him to. Figure out what that troubled man was planning to do in the middle of that mountain. Harrington had given sedatives to Martha and Nina, which made them sleep. Bridger went back to his office and started to put together all the information he had gathered. He put Monroe's diaries, the marked map, the records of old disappearances, and the drawings of symbols found in the caves on his desk, and tried to put them all together to make sense of what he was facing. Monroe was more than just a killer. It was now clear, he was something stranger and maybe even more dangerous. A man who was obsessed with philosophy and thought he was on a quest for transcendental knowledge. He had spent decades exploring those caves, mapping their depths, and looking for something he thought was down there. The women he took with him weren't just victims. He carefully picked them, trained them for months, and made them believe they were a part of something bigger than themselves. But what did he really mean to look for? The people's diaries talked about portals, the spaces between states of consciousness, and the chance to reach parts of existence that modern science doesn't study. It was a mess of mysticism, twisted philosophy, and things that were almost completely crazy. Bridger read over one entry in Monroe's diary several times. It was from 1898 and was about a discovery Monroe had made deep inside the caves. He talked about finding a chamber where the groundwater formed a lake that was so still and dark that the torch couldn't shine on the bottom, and he said that area was where he had an experience that changed everything he knew about reality. Monroe talked about how she felt detached, like she was floating between worlds, and how she heard voices that seemed to come from the rock itself. He saw this as proof that he had found a powerful spot, a place where the line between the real world and the next world was thinner. Ever since then, he has been dedicated to. He spent his whole life trying to get over that barrier for good. In his skewed view, the women he brought with him were willing participants in rituals that were supposed to make this crossing easier. He thought that some people would be more sensitive to these experiences than others, and he spent years finding and training those he thought would be best. It didn't seem to bother him that none of them ever came back. Instead, he saw it as a sign of success, proof that they had successfully crossed over to on the other side. Bridger put his eyes shut and rubbed his temples. He had to deal with the mind of someone who was very troubled and had made sense of horrible actions through a set of beliefs that only made sense to that person. Perhaps most scary was the fact that Monroe seemed to really believe everything she said. In his writings, he didn't show any cynicism or admit guilt or regret. Instead, he was completely sure that he was doing something important and necessary. The two men Bridger had left in the caves finally came out around noon. Came back. They came in tired, muddy, and with worried looks on their faces. They went to the sheriff's office and told him what they had found. They had gone as far as they could in the deepest tunnel. The passage went down steeper and steeper until it turned into a nearly vertical climb where you had to hold on to slippery rock ledges. The sound of the water got louder as they went down. Finally, after what they thought was a 50-meter descent, they reached the room Monroe had written about in his diary. The underground lake existed. It was a vast, still body of black water that went beyond what their flashlights could see. The room around it was round, and the ceiling rose like a natural dome that had been shaped by water over thousands of years. Minerals that were wet on the walls sparkled and reflected the torchlight in patterns that were almost hypnotic. And there were clear signs on the shore of the lake that Monroe had been there not long ago. There were logs from a campfire, candle remains, and more of those strange designs carved into the rocks nearby. But what scared me the most were the things that were lined up in a perfect circle around a certain point at the water's edge. They were personal items like wedding rings, brooches, hair combs with designs, small prayer books, and lockets with pictures of loved ones. It was clear that each item belonged to a different person. The men found a total of 12 groups of objects, 12 women whose lives had been stolen for many years. As a kind of macabre memorial or ritual, they left their most valuable things there. An offering. Monroe was not there, though. There was no body and no signs of a fight or an accident. There were only those carefully placed objects and the suffocating silence of that underground room. The men had called his name, and the stone walls had echoed back more than once, but no one had answered. They went as far around the lake as they could, but the water went too far out, and they couldn't go any further without the right gear. Eventually, they ran out of food and were afraid they would be trapped down. They chose to come back to the surface and tell everyone what they had found. Bridger listened quietly, taking in everything. Then he asked if they had seen anything strange in the water, like a disturbance, or a sign that someone or something might be under it. The men looked at each other in an awkward way. Finally, one of them said that they had seen something strange. Once, the water's smooth surface had a very slow swirl, like something was moving around in the depths, making a soft but noticeable sound. Current that can be felt. The constant noise of the water dripping was accompanied by a very low sound that was almost imperceptible. This sound could have been the cave's natural echo, or it could have been something else, a murmur, a vibration, something from very, very far below. Bridger spent the next few days planning a bigger trip to fully explore the caves. He knew he needed men with experience, the right tools, and a well-thought-out plan. He could only take so much risk. Lives by going into that underground maze without being ready. At the same time, Dr. Harrington started to help Martha and Eleanor slowly get better. Eleanor was the first person who could talk about what had happened in a way that made sense. 5 days after being saved, on a rainy afternoon, she asked to talk to Bridger. As she told her story in a voice that was still weak but surprisingly firm, he sat next to her bed with his notebook in hand. Eliana said she knew Monroe from about a year ago. Someone had come to her door and offered her firewood for the winter. She gladly accepted, since she always has a hard time doing everything by herself. Monroe had come back more than once, and he was always nice and helpful. He talked to her about books, philosophy, and existential questions that Eleanor had never thought anyone would talk about. In a way she had never felt before, she felt seen and understood. Monroe slowly started to talk about what he had found in the caves and how reality worked in those places. It was possible to experience expanded states of consciousness in a different way. He asked her to go to these places and said the experience would change her. Eleanor agreed because she was lonely and looking for meaning in her life. Monroe showed her a shallow area of the caves during the day, like it was a secret to keep. That was the first time she went there. He talked about the symbols carved into the walls and said that those places had been known to people in the past. Eleanor felt unique, chosen to share what they know. The visits went on for months, with each one getting deeper and longer. Monroe taught her how to meditate and breathe, getting her ready for what he called the final experience. Eleanor had full faith in him. He didn't think there was any risk. She had no idea that she was being lied to. She hadn't been forced to leave on the day she went missing. She chose to meet Monroe on her own because she thought she would finally be a part of the ritual he talked so much about. Eleanor didn't start to feel scared until they got to the deepest chamber and Monroe tied her to a rock, telling her it was part of the process. It was too late by then. She was in that dark place for weeks. Monroe would come down from time to time with water and small amounts of food. He would talk to her and tell her that he was getting her ready and that she needed to fast and be alone to clean her body. He told her she would be ready for the last crossing soon. Eleanor had tried to argue, beg. Monroe stayed calm and determined, though, as if he were doing something holy. Eleanor didn't realize she wasn't the only one until Martha showed up, tied to the same pile of rocks. Since Martha had been captured weeks before, she was even weaker. During the long hours of darkness, when Monroe wasn't around, the two women whispered to each other and told each other their stories. They saw the pattern. Monroe dealt with both of them in the same way. The first act of kindness, the philosophical, the slow and careful preparation, the conversations, and the gradual invitations to explore the caves. He was methodically patient, building trust over months before finally telling everyone what he really wanted to do. Eleanor thought for a moment before going on, her eyes fixed on something far away. Then she said Monroe had seemed different the last time he went down into the cell where they were locked up. He felt a sense of urgency and almost feverish excitement that he hadn't had before. He said that he knew what he had to do and realized that all the other attempts had failed because he hadn't made the sacrifice that was needed. In the past, he had talked about the other women he had taken to the caves. He didn't call them victims. Instead, he called them pioneers who had tried to cross the line but failed because they were still too tied to the real world. Monroe said that he knew he had made a mistake. Helping other people wasn't enough. His own body had to be the one to cross, to make this. Said sorry for something that surprised both of them. He said that he now knew he had been wrong, and that he had brought them there for the wrong reasons because he had a wrong understanding of what he had found. Monroe then showed them a small notebook that he always had on him. It had an in-depth map of the caves, some with passages that took him years to find and map. He also gave details on how to get out of there that he had never shared before. People should use what he told them to get away if something happened to him. Monroe then got a flashlight and went down the tunnel that led to the lake below the ground. Eleanor and Martha could hear his footsteps getting farther away, after which there was nothing but silence. He never came back. Their wait had been hours or even a day. It's not clear in the never-ending darkness. They thought about trying to escape by following the directions in the notebook. However, they were too weak and scared to go any further and get lost in the caves. And just as they were about to give up, they heard voices far away. Voices of people who were not Monroe's. That's when Bridger and his men found them for good. In silence, Bridger took it all in. He asked some clarifying questions, took notes on specifics, and then asked Eleanor if she had any ideas about what Monroe might have said, planned to do in that lake underground. She slowly shook her head, but then she said something that made Bridger jump. Monroe had talked many times about submersion and how water was a part of change and moving between states. He had talked about rituals from different ancient cultures that involved submerging oneself in deep water to see visions or go to other worlds. Monroe had said something strange when he said goodbye to them last night. "We're talking." Martha woke up and listened. "We're talking." Martha woke up and listened in silence from the bed next to her. She finally spoke in a hoofbeat voice. She added something that Eleanor hadn't thought of. Monroe was carrying something when he last went down. He had a heavy chain used to restrain animals wrapped around his body, and he also had a big stone that he had looked at for hours. You can choose from the cave's rock formations. Bridger immediately understood what it meant. Monroe wasn't just going to jump into the lake. He meant for himself to sink and not come back. In the days that followed, Bridger put together a group of 10 men, 2 of whom had previously scuba dived and recovered objects from lakes and rivers. He went and got extra flashlights, strong ropes, and safety gear. He got ready to go back into the caves, but this time with that they wanted to explore that underground lake and find out what had really happened to Monroe. But Bridger did something he thought was important before he left. He went to see Sarah Brennan, the person who had first told him about Monroe. He found her at her simple home on the edge of Millvale. This time, she didn't wear a veil or hide her face, which was scarred from years of guilt and silence. Bridger told her that Eleanor and Martha were still alive and getting better. He saw her face light up with relief then. She didn't try to hold back her tears. They talked about how her sister met Monroe in the days before she disappeared in 1889. He told her he needed to know everything about her sister. Sarah talked for a long time. She talked about things she had never told anyone and memories she had kept for years. Rebecca, her sister, was a strong and independent woman who refused to get married just to fit in with her friends. She liked having her own freedom and independence, even if it meant living alone and being judged by. Talking to her in a smart way and paying real attention to her. Sarah remembered how her sister talked about him with more and more respect. How Monroe got things that other men didn't bother to get. How he made her feel important because she was independent, not because she was independent. Sarah said that at the time she had been jealous. Her sister looked so happy and excited about the philosophical. Monroe showed her places in the hills, and she talked about them with him. Then, one fall day in 1889, Rebecca just didn't come home. Sarah waited, looked, and begged the police to look into it. But at that time, adult women who disappeared on their own were not a big deal. People thought they had left and started a new life somewhere else. Sarah had always thought that bad things had happened, but he had no proof. All he had was a thought that no one took seriously, and she kept quiet for years while other women went missing. Her silence was like a stone on her chest. She kept wondering if she could have stopped it, if she should have been more insistent or spoken louder. Bridger tried to make her feel better. He told her that she had done the best she could under the circumstances and that no one could have known how obsessed Monroe would become. But the words didn't make sense to him either. The truth was that this man had been doing this for decades, while the whole community looked on and did nothing. Everyone stopped him because they didn't really want to see. 3 days later, when Bridger finally went back to the caves, he brought not only tools and experienced men with him, but also a new sense of purpose. Monroe, alive or dead, had to be found. Not just for justice's sake, he had to end this story for good. It was also for the families who never got answers and the women whose fates were unknown for so long. It took several hours to get to the underground lake. The path was dangerous even for those who were well prepared, and very tiring. When they finally got to the round chamber with the dark, still water, Bridger felt the chill that his men had told him about. People were affected by that place in a very basic way, a sense of an unimaginable depth and vastness that went beyond the physical. On the shore of the lake, the things were still set up in a circle. There are 12 sets of personal items, and each one represents a life that was cut short or a story that would never have a natural ending. Bridger told his men to get everything. Carefully. Those things had to go back to their families. They were not getting the respect they deserved. After that, he looked at the water. He told the 2 divers he brought to start getting ready. They put long ropes around their waists, checked their gear, and turned on flashlights that were made to be used underwater. It was an easy plan. They would go down by following the chamber wall and staying in contact with the rock as they explored the outside as far as it was safe to do so. The first diver slowly went in. Flashlight made a halo of light that got dimmer as he went. Bridger and the others held the rope out in the water and watched from the shore, counting the seconds. After about 3 minutes, the rope stopped getting longer. They held out. No sign of coming back. The rope was then slowly pulled back. People helped the diver come to the surface. He was shaking when he got out of the water. And not just because it was cold. He said that he had gone down about 15 meters by following the stone wall. The lake looked like it was a lot deeper. Even though his flashlight couldn't reach the bottom, he did find a chain stuck between some rocks about halfway down. This is the chain that Martha had said Monroe was carrying. Attached to it were pieces of fabric that might have been Monroe's clothes, but there was no body. It was tightly wound around a ledge. The current went down and disappeared into the dark. The diver tried to follow it, but the depth was making his lungs and ears hurt. Besides that, there was something else that made him run away. He said that the water below him felt like it was moving, like a big thing was swirling in it. He agreed that it was probably just underground currents, but the complete darkness and biting cold were enough to make him decide to go back. The second diver was eager to go further. He was. He was more skilled and had said he had dived in rivers that were much more dangerous. Bridger thought for a while and then agreed. They tied on a longer rope and increased the number of safety measures. The man then went into the water and quickly disappeared into the darkness. This time, the wait was a lot longer. The rope kept unraveling for a long time. When the rope finally stopped, Bridger started to feel scared and thought about pulling him back. They held out. There was no action. After that, 3 shakes of the rope were done, the agreed-upon sign to start pulling him back. When? By the time the diver came to the surface, he was holding a big, heavy rock that Monroe would have used to hold himself in place. Tied to the rock with wire was a metal box that is used to keep important papers dry. Bridger grabbed the box with shaking hands. Around the edges, wax was used to seal it. It took him a while to break the seal and open the lid. A notebook was inside, wrapped in oilcloth to keep it safe. The last diary of Monroe. Sitting on the edge of that underground lake, lit up. Bridger read Monroe's last words with the flickering light of the torches. Monroe's handwriting was rushed and less careful than in other diaries, as if he were writing against the clock. Monroe began by owning up to his mistakes. He admitted that he had hurt people and taken away their lives, but he insisted that he had never done anything meant to hurt or be cruel. He really thought he was pushing the limits of what people knew and looking for answers to questions that both religion and mainstream science ignored. He talked about the things that had happened to him in that chamber over the years, like how he had felt detached and seen things in deep meditation. He talked about the lake as if it were a living thing, a way to get to something that was beyond our understanding at the time. He also said that his attempts to bring other people through that portal had failed because he didn't fully understand what he was looking for. The last few pages of the diary were different. They were more focused and had more. Clear in a way. Monroe wrote that he finally understood that the journey had to be done alone, that no one else could cross it for them, and that everyone had to make their own choice. Monroe had made his own choice. He went into great detail about his plan. He would put the heavy stone on the chain and tie it around his body. Then he would let himself sink to the bottom of the lake. He had no idea what was down there. Maybe just dark water and drowning to death. There might be more, but he was eager to learn. The last entry was only one line, written in clear handwriting. I came here on my own free will to find answers that only darkness can give. If anyone finds this, please know that. That was all Bridger did to close the notebook. Looking at the black, still water surface of the lake, he imagined Monroe falling into it and choosing not to fight or try to breathe. Instead, he just let himself go. A terrible sadness filled the scene. Lost a whole life looking for meaning in places. That place was empty and full of death. It was proven by the diver who brought the box up that he had looked down. The current kept going down because it was stuck on the rock, but he still couldn't get to the bottom. Simply put, the depth was too great for people to reach without special gear. Monroe would stay down there for all time if he was there. At that moment, Bridger made a choice. No more efforts would be made to find Monroe's body. He didn't see any reason to take the risk because it was too high, and putting more lives at risk for a man who had chosen to die that way. Monroe would stay where he had chosen to be, and the lake would keep its secret. Bridger thought it was a strange form of justice, but it might have been the only one that could work in this case. Before he left the chamber, Bridger told his men to close the doorway that led there. They blocked the tunnel with rocks and mortar they made from minerals found in the cave. This made it hard for anyone else to go down. It wasn't not an impenetrable wall, but it would be enough to keep people from looking and stop accidents from happening again. It was night when they finally got back to the surface. The stars shone over the hills of Pennsylvania, not caring about the human dramas going on below. Bridger took a deep breath of the cool night air. He felt like he was waking up from a nightmare that had been going on for months. In the days that followed, he worked hard at the difficult task of telling the families. He went to see each one personally and brought the things that were found in the underground chamber. These were painful talks that made me cry tears I hadn't shed in years. Some families were angry and wanted to know why it took so long and why no one had properly looked into it at the time. Others were just thankful to have finally reached some kind of resolution, even if it was only partially complete. Sarah Brennan got her sister Rebecca's locket, which is made of silver and has a small portrait inside. She held it in her hands for a long time and ran her fingers over the surface. If she could connect with her sister in some way. Then she asked Bridger if Monroe had hurt Rebecca and caused her pain. Bridger was careful about what he said. He said he thought Monroe had gotten those women to go with him on their own free will, and that he wasn't violent in the usual sense, but rather someone who used words and lies to get what he wanted. He didn't say what he really thought happened to those women who never came back. There were ideas and scary possibilities that he opted not to look into it out loud. Perhaps Monroe took them to that underground lake and persuaded them to do some kind of ritual that involved submersion. They never came back from it. Maybe he had left them in the caves and left them to die of thirst and hunger. It's possible that the bodies were still in other rooms or places that they never found. They would never really know for sure. That might have been best after all. Some families needed clear answers, while others just wanted to be able to move. They wanted to move forward, and Bridger did his best to give it to them. Martha and Elelena's slow but steady recovery went on. Dr. Harrington said that they were getting stronger and gaining weight, but the psychological damage was worse and would take a lot longer to heal if it ever did. Both had nightmares all the time. Elelena had a strong phobia of small spaces and couldn't go into a room without a window without getting scared. Martha had lost all trust in everyone. Of men, especially those who were nice or tried to help. Over the next few weeks, Bridger visited them often, always with the polite and understanding Dr. Harrington. He wasn't in a hurry because he needed official statements from them to end the case for good. He would wait until they were ready for as long as it took. Martha was the one who finally asked to give her full story, almost a month after she was saved. She told me she had to do this because it was part of getting better. Putting everything into words helped her turn the trauma into a story that she could store and forget about. Bridger paid close attention as she told him everything about being captured and held captive. Martha talked about the long talks she had with Monroe while he had been getting her ready for months. He talked about being alone and how society didn't understand people who had different ideas or who were looking for more than what everyday life had to offer. Martha, who was widowed and living alone on her estate, deeply understood these feelings. Words. For the first time in years, she felt like someone understood her. Monroe had told her to take her time and see the caves. First, there are the surface areas, which are beautiful and safe. He talked about geological features and told tales about how those caves were sacred to people in the past. Martha was thoroughly interested, and when he finally suggested that she take part in a unique ritual that not many people were able to do, she gladly agreed. She only saw the mistake now, when she was already locked up in the deep room. Monroe calmly told her that she would have to go through a cleansing process before the final ritual, which could take weeks or even months, but was necessary. Martha had first tried to argue, then beg, and finally scream, but Monroe had stayed calm. He would visit her from time to time, bring her water and food, and talk about being patient and ready. Martha said it wasn't the cold, the hunger, or even the fear of dying that was the worst. The worst part was losing her shape and feeling like she was losing her shape and feeling like she was breaking apart. When Ilalanina showed up, she was also in jail. At first, Martha was glad to have company, but her happiness quickly turned to horror when she realized Monroe was repeating the pattern so that another woman would fall for the same trick. The two, they had talked in whispers during the long, dark hours, telling each other stories and keeping each other mentally alert and sane. Monroe had changed after that. When he apologized and let them go from the ropes on his last visit, he seemed different. Martha said she wasn't sure if he really felt bad about what he did or if he was just sad that his experiment had failed again. He may have finally realized that he couldn't make other people see things the way he did. Bridger carefully wrote down everything. When Martha was done, he thanked her for having the guts to tell him about something so painful. Then he asked her a question that had been on his mind for weeks. Did she want him to tell everyone about the case? The Pittsburgh newspapers wanted more information because they wanted to make it into a shocking story that would sell a lot of copies. Martha gave it a lot of thought before she spoke. She finally said no. She didn't want the news about her life to be all about her. They didn't want her to be known as the woman who had been hurt by the crazy person in the cave. People were interested in her death, but she just wanted to try to rebuild her life in peace, out of the public eye. Elena agreed with everything when she was asked. Both wanted the case to be filed quietly, without a lot of attention from the public. Bridger thought about their wishes and decided to honor them. He wrote detailed official reports that were turned into the county, but he didn't give the newspapers any newsworthy information. He only said that the women who were missing had been found alive and that the person who did it was dead, so the case was over. It's clear that there were complaints. Some reporters said that the public had a right to know, but Bridger wouldn't give in. He decided that some stories didn't need to be told with all of their details. The only people who know some truths about the situation might be the ones who keep them in dusty files. The county told the fire department to burn down the empty land where the first tunnel was found. A concrete wall blocked the entrance to the main cave, and a warning sign was put in place to warn people of the dangers of collapse. It didn't say anything about what was down there. Martha sold her house in the end and moved to a small town in western Pennsylvania, where no one knew who she was or what her story was. She stayed in Millvale for a few more months before leaving too, but Bridger never found out where she went. This time, they both just left the area, this time on purpose, to start over somewhere new where the past wouldn't follow them. After that, there was a heavy silence for many years. Who lived in the hills north of Pittsburgh? Bridger was sheriff of Allegheny County for another 10 years. During that time, he dealt with minor thefts, common crimes, and sometimes more serious cases. But those dark months of 1901 and 1902 were the worst ever. Something about him had changed deeply because of that experience, and the change would not go away over time. In his office, he locked Monroe's diaries in a certain drawer. He would sometimes do it late at night, when the building was empty and quiet. He pulled them out and read some parts again, not because he was morbidly interested or bored, but because he felt a strange duty to understand that man, to figure out how someone could get so lost in their own twisted mind that they lost touch with basic humanity. Monroe wasn't a typical monster. He wasn't angry or wanting to hurt people. In a way, he was worse than her because he had built a complicated philosophical framework to defend herself. Who did terrible things because he honestly thought he was looking for important information? That thought scared Bridger more than any nightmares about dark caves or lakes below ground. He thought about the women who were lost a lot. Rebecca Brennan, Sarah Brennan's sister, and the other women whose names she found in old files, a total of 10 women over the course of almost 20 years, just disappeared. Their bodies were probably still in that underground maze, in rooms that no one had ever been in. Depths that would never be reached again. Bridger sometimes thought that those places, deep underground and quiet, held secrets that no one else would ever find. He imagined that nature would slowly take back everything, and that water and time would wash away even the last signs of those lives that had been cut short. This thought was both peaceful and very sad. Sarah Brennan never got over the death of her sister, but she did find some comfort in it. Of peace after she got the medallion back from Bridger. She started going to church more often and found comfort in being around other women who had lost loved ones in different ways. After many years, Bridger finally found out that she had left the hills that held so many painful memories to live with a cousin in Ohio. Over time, the families of the other victims had different reactions. Some people never got over the fact that there weren't any bodies of definitive confirmation. They held on to unrealistic hopes that maybe their daughters, sisters, and aunts were still alive somewhere, but they had lost their memories, or were being held captive for some strange reason. Others were glad that Bridger had given them some closure. They held private memorials and found other ways to honor the dead without needing graves. The area itself changed over time. People learned to stay away from the hills where the caves used to be. Hunters who used to walk those trails started to go in different directions. Lumberjacks worked in areas that were farther away. The properties that are alone, that were spread out across the area, were left empty one after another. They moved their families closer to towns and villages where there were more people, which made them feel safer. As the years went by, the story turned into a legend. There were new interpretations added by people who hadn't lived through the events, and only new pieces of them in whispers. They talked about the caveman like he was some kind of supernatural being, instead of a man who was very upset. They told stories about the caves as if they were scary places that were cursed by forces that are beyond our understanding. Bridger felt both frustrated and hopeless as he listened to these stories. The truth was scary enough without any made-up details, but he knew that people needed to turn horror into stories and make it more manageable through mythology. That's how they dealt with something that would have been too heavy to carry otherwise. Bridger finally quit working for the government in 1915, when he was 62 years old and tired from years of service. They spent their last years in a small house on the outskirts of Pittsburgh, where they grew a small garden and sometimes had former co-workers over to talk about old times. But he didn't talk about the Monroe case very often, and when he didn't give specifics or make it personal. Only one time did he talk about it in an open way. On a fall afternoon in 1919, a young, ambitious reporter found him and knocked on his door, asking to speak with him. The kid had. I was interested in the case because there weren't many public details about it when I looked it up in the county archives. I wanted to write an investigation piece to bring the story to light after many years. Bridger said no at first, but the young man kept asking, and in the end, the old sheriff agreed to talk on one condition. While he was still alive, nothing he said would be made public, and even after he died, it would be presented in a way that kept the identities of the victims safe. The reporter agreed, and for 3 afternoons in a row, Bridger told the entire story. The man talked about Monroe, the caves, the diaries, and the skewed ideas that had pushed that man into darkness. He talked about Martha and Elelena and how brave they were to stay alive and start over with their lives. He talked about families who had lost loved ones and never had clear answers. He talked about how fragile people are and how we all walk a fine line between being sane and crazy, between being connected and being alone. The reporter paid close attention to everything, took careful notes, and he thanked Bridger for trusting him when he was done, but he never put the story out there. Some stories didn't need to be told, and the reporter, who was now a respected editor, would say that he had decided that some horrors should stay buried so that only those who needed to know about them would know about them. This was years after Bridger had died. The caves stayed closed. There were sometimes small collapses that made way for new openings. This happened most often when it rained a lot. In each case, the local government acted quickly, resealed them, which kept the area limited. Over the years, the forest took back that whole area. Over the scars in the ground, trees grew. The old paths were hidden by thick bushes, and it became nearly impossible to find where the entrances had been. The underground lake stayed empty, and Monroe's things that he had brought with him were safe in its dark waters. No modern expedition has ever been sent there to properly explore it. There wasn't enough scientific interest to make the risk and cost worth it, and the government wanted to leave the area alone. People who lived nearby said they heard strange sounds coming from that direction, especially on winter nights when the wind howled through the pine trees on the hills. The sounds were low and almost imperceptible, and they could have been the wind blowing through cracks in the rocks, but they could also have been something else. No one looked into it too deeply. After some thought, they chose to leave some things alone. Martha lived until 1947, when she was 74 years old. She married again. She moved to a new city and met a nice carpenter who never asked her about her past. Their 2 daughters never really knew what their mother had been through as they grew up. Martha kept those memories to herself and only told her husband about them in the most private of times. When the darkness of night brought back memories of those weeks in the caves, Elena was no longer found in historical records. She had left Pennsylvania. There are signs that she may have gone to the West Coast and changed her route, and began from scratch with no name. Nobody knows for sure if she found peace or lived the rest of her life with the trauma she went through. It's possible for the lack of information to be its own response, a choice to erase the past and only be in the present. Many of the affected families' descendants still live in the area, but not all of them know the whole story. It was something that wasn't passed down from one generation to the next on purpose. It was a family secret that fell apart over time. Time. Sometimes, someone finds old references in family papers or a name that leads to research in county records. For a short time, pieces of the truth become visible before being filed away again and forgotten. The hills stay put, oblivious to the human drama going on inside them. They are still just hills with thick forests, icy streams, and rocky outcroppings that were there millions of years before anyone walked on them and will still be there millions of years from now. Nature has this freeing power, perspective that makes us realize how small and short-lived we are and how dramatized our lives are. Monroe rests somewhere below those hills, in dark waters that never see the light of day. There will never be an answer to the question of whether he found the answers he was looking for, or whether he experienced the transcendence he so desired. Instead, there will only be the cold, final emptiness of death. It might make sense that way. It's not always possible to solve mysteries. There are no good answers to some questions. What's left is. Memories are kept in old, dusty diaries and files that have been forgotten. And maybe a lesson about how fragile the mind is, how being alone can change how we see things, how looking for meaning can take us to places we can't get back from, and how we should be wary of people who say they can give us easy answers to hard questions or purpose where there is only emptiness. People who live in that area now don't think much about the caves that are sealed off below them. That makes sense too. They should live their normal lives, worry about normal problems, and find joy in simple things. Life keeps going, no matter what. It flows around the problems of the past, like water flows around rocks in a stream. But those of us who have heard this story now have a small piece of that dark knowledge. There are depths we would never guess are there beneath the surface of normalcy and peace in everyday life. That regular people can have strange obsessions. That darkness isn't just in the woods and caves, but also inside us, waiting for the right conditions to come out. This case that spooked people in the hills of Pennsylvania more than 100 years ago may have taught us that. Not about monsters or haunted places, but about how important it is to connect with others, be a part of a community, and care about each other. Because those women were weak because they were alone. Monroe was able to work without being seen because he lived alone. That pattern was able to keep happening for so long because no one paid attention. We live in. Times have changed, and Monroe could never have imagined the communication systems that exist today. They make it impossible to disappear so completely. But people still need to connect with others, feel like they belong, and be seen and understood. And as long as there are people who are lonely and alone, there will be people who can take advantage of that. Remember to pay attention if we learn anything from this story. To pay attention when someone close to us is having a hard time by themselves. To offer real connection instead of letting others do it for you. Promise things that won't happen. To make places where people don't have to look for meaning in the dark because they've already found it in the light. The caves are still locked. Its secrets are safe with the lake, and the PA hills are still and quiet under the big sky. Mute witnesses to stories they'd rather not talk about. On the other hand, it is our duty to remember, not to revel in the horror, but to learn from it and become better, more aware, and more connected. Because that was what was missing. The end. Connection, care, and attention. And these are things that each of us can do every day in small ways that could stop tragedies from happening in the future. This story may have moved you or made you think or feel deeply. Please show your support by subscribing to this channel. Drop your thoughts in the box below. Small acts of kindness can sometimes keep the worst things from happening.